discover of the most shocking ways royals have died. From the Greek king killed by a monkey to the English conqueror who buckled under his own weight. In fairy tales, princes and princesses lived charmed lives that always include a happy ending. But as this list of 11 royal deaths proves, monarchs have met plenty of bizarre ends over the centuries. Some of the royals included here had a fatal interaction with food, like the king who ate too many lampreys, another king who ate too many pastries, and the duke who was drowned in a vat of wine. Others met shocking ends while firing cannons, recovering from an illness, or trying to become immortal. Though many are better known for what they accomplished in life, quite a few of the royals on this list are only remembered because of the bizarre way they died. In life, this conqueror established a reputation as a brilliant military mind, a powerful king, and the force that created the largest empire in the ancient world. But Alexander the Great's death at the age of 32 has left historians scratching their heads. By 323 BC, the year that he died, Alexander the Great had established a far-flung empire that covered some 2 million square miles, according to the BBC. After inheriting the kingdom of Macedonia, he'd steadily conquered so much land that his kingdom stretched from Greece all the way to India. But as he prepared to expand his empire, Alexander the Great was suddenly struck by a mysterious fever in Babylon, present-day Iraq. Over the next 12 days, the great conqueror grew sicker and sicker. According to the Smithsonian, Alexander the Great suffered from a pain in his back that felt like being impaled with a spear, unquenchable thirst, and creeping paralysis. Before long, the conqueror couldn't even raise his head. By the time he died in June 323 BC, no one was sure exactly what had killed him. Adding to the mystery was the fact that Alexander the Great's body allegedly didn't decompose for 6 full days, which, according to history, led some of his contemporaries to believe that he wasn't a man at all, but rather a god. So how did Alexander the Great die? This royal death has confounded historians for years. Some believe that he was infected by malaria, while others suspect that the conqueror was actually poisoned. One scholar, Catherine Hall, even posited that he suffered from the neurological disorder Guillain-Barré syndrome, which would have paralyzed him to the point that he would have seemed dead though wasn't yet, thus explaining his slow decomposition. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden was a middling king who would have likely left little mark on history if not for the way he died. On February 12, 1771, the Swedish monarch apparently ate himself to death. Until that point, Adolf Frederick hadn't accomplished much. According to ancient origins, he was born a younger son of a Swedish noble who, thanks to maneuvering by Elizabeth of Russia, ended up as heir to the Swedish throne. Once there, he was more a figurehead than a ruler. But though Adolf Frederick had little power, he had a royal appetite. And as the monarch prepared for Lent in 1771, he sat down for a feast fit for a king. On Fettestagen, or Fat Tuesday, Adolf Frederick tucked into a meal that included lobster, caviar, kippers, sauerkraut, boiled meats, and turnips, all washed down with generous pours of champagne. He might have survived the night if he'd stopped there, but the king also called for a dessert. After his feast, Adolf Frederick enjoyed semlas, Swedish pastries filled with cream that were traditionally eaten on Fat Tuesday. Not only did the king feast on 14 of these pastries, but he also enjoyed them alongside a bowl of hot milk flavored with cinnamon and raisins. Unsurprisingly, he complained of a stomachache soon afterward. The king's stomachache got worse and worse until Adolf Frederick died, apparently from severe digestive problems. His embarrassing royal death cemented the king in history, and indeed, he's remembered for little else. As the King of Scotland, James II was known for his fiery temper, equally fiery facial birthmark, and his interest in weapons of war. But as he prepared to besiege the English-held Roxburgh Castle in 1460, the 29-year-old king's passion for weaponry proved fatal when a cannon exploded and killed him. Called James of the Fiery Face because of a birthmark, James II led a short and violent life. According to Undiscovered Scotland, he assumed the throne at the age of 6 following the murder of his father, James I, and allegedly stabbed a defiant noble to death in his early 20s. He deeply desired to expand Scotland's power and, in 1460, decided to lay siege to the English-held Roxburgh Castle, just as his father had done more than 20 years earlier. To ensure his success, James II ordered some special new cannons from Flanders. As the king stood with his troops on August 3, 1460, he ordered one of the cannons, called the Lion, to be fired. According to the medievalists, James II may have simply wanted to show off his new weapon, or he may have wanted to salute the arrival of his wife, Queen Mary. In any case, the cannon went off and then exploded. As the medievalist reports, the firing of the cannon loosened one of the wedges that held its iron rings in place. As a result, the cannon's barrel broke loose, sailed through the air, and smashed into the king's leg, effectively snapping his thigh in two. James II collapsed, bled out, and died quickly. His royal death remains one of the most explosive in human history. Charles II of Navarre developed such a reputation that he became known as Charles the Bad, but a more appropriate name might be Charles the Burned, since in 1387, the French monarch was accidentally burned alive. The grandson of French King Louis X, Charles adamantly believed that he should inherit the French throne. But his ambitions were thwarted by others who declared that, since Charles's link to the monarchy came through his mother, he didn't have the strongest claim. The throne instead passed to his mother's uncle, Philip de Valois, and then to Philip's son, John the Good. Charles the Bad spent most of the rest of his life scheming to usurp John the Good. He plotted with the English, the Spanish, and his fellow Frenchmen. But by 1387, the royal had fallen ill. As History Collection reports, doctors attempted to treat Charles II's illness by wrapping him in linen soaked in brandy, aquavita, ethanol, and wine. To ensure that this treatment worked, they ordered that the King of Navarre would be stitched into the linens every night. But on January 1st, something went wrong. Having sewn Charles II into his linens, one of his servants searched for scissors to cut off a loose thread. When she couldn't find any, she decided to burn off the loose thread with a nearby candlestick and set the ailing king on fire. As medieval author and historian Jean Froissart wrote of the incident, by the pleasure of God or of the devil, the fire caught to his sheets, and from that to his person, swathed as it was in matter highly inflammable. One of the most bizarre royal deaths on this list must belong to Alexander of Greece, who, in 1920, died after being bitten by a Barbary macaque monkey. By the time of his death at the age of 27, Alexander had been king for just 3 years. According to Royal Central, he took the throne after his father and elder brother were forced into exile during World War I. But Alexander wouldn't have long to reign. On October 2, 1920, the young monarch went for a stroll around Athens with his dog, Fritz, near the Tatwa estate. Then, the king suddenly crossed paths with a monkey that belonged to a servant. When Fritz and the monkey started to scuffle, Alexander put himself between the two animals and suffered from a number of monkey bites. Though Alexander initially dismissed the wounds as nothing, they soon became infected and, before long, the young king suffered from sepsis. As the New York Times reported, his heartbeat became weak and his breathing labored, until his doctors concluded that his condition was hopeless. On October 25, 1920, King Alexander of Greece died. But his early demise wasn't just a tragedy for his family. Alexander's death set off a chain of events that culminated with several devastating military losses for Greece, leading Winston Churchill to quip, "It is perhaps no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 persons died of this monkey's bite." From the bloody War of the Roses came an especially shocking royal death, that of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who was allegedly forcibly drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine in 1478. That complicated conflict pitted those loyal to House York against those aligned with House Lancaster, and Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, fell somewhere in between. Though a York by birth, he was the younger son of Richard, Duke of York, and the brother of King Edward IV. Plantagenet's loyalties wobbled. Apparently envious of his brother's throne, Plantagenet frequently schemed against him. He even helped put the Lancaster king Henry VI on the throne for a second time in 1470, though he came to his brother's aid the next year and fought to help restore Edward IV as king. Nevertheless, Edward IV soon grew suspicious. Convinced that his brother sought to usurp him, Edward IV threw Plantagenet into the Tower of London. As History Collection reported, the king personally made the case of his brother's guilt before Parliament, which agreed that the Duke of Clarence was guilty of treason. And so, on February 18, 1478, Plantagenet was put to death in the Tower of London. History Hit noted that because of his nobility, Plantagenet's execution was conducted in private. But it didn't take long for strange rumors about the Duke's death to spread across England. As the story goes, the Duke of Clarence was put to death by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. It's possible that he was allowed to choose his method of execution and opted to be drowned in wine as a parting shot against his brother, a well-known drinker. But it's also possible that Edward gave the command to drown his brother. Either way, the Duke of Clarence's royal death is certainly one of the stranger ones in history. William the Conqueror's death was apt for someone with his nickname, as he died after a battle in 1087. But it was the aftermath of William's demise that made his death especially bizarre. There are basically two accounts of the events that led to William the Conqueror's death. The first states that William, the first Norman king of England, suffered from something akin to heatstroke while fighting in a battle. The second suggests that the then portly king was impaled by the wooden pommel of his saddle, which ruptured his intestines. Though the king survived the battle, he died from his wounds on September 9, 1087, and his funeral would ensure that no one ever forgot his royal death. According to an account written by the Benedictine monk and chronicler Orderic Vitalis, mourners gathered in Abbaye Uxhams in present-day Caen, France, to say goodbye to the king. But as William the Conqueror's bloated corpse was forced into a too small sarcophagus, his body exploded. His swollen bowels burst, and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders and the whole crowd, Orderic wrote. As mourners fled, the priests tried to conduct the rest of William's funeral as quickly as possible, but nothing could mask the stench. Qin Shi Huangdi's death in 210 BC came as a surprise, especially to him. As the story goes, the Chinese emperor died after seeking a draft that he hoped would make him live forever. The founder of the Qin dynasty and the first emperor to rule over a unified China, Shi Huangdi was subject to numerous assassination attempts during his life. According to world history, he developed an obsession with death. Specifically, the emperor became obsessed with avoiding it at all costs. Ancient origins reported that the emperor constructed elevated walkways and private roads, covered his windows with curtains, and put anyone to death who dared share his location. He searched far and wide for some kind of elixir he could drink to make himself immortal, and, apparently, found one. Though the exact details of Qin Shi Huangdi's royal death have been obscured by time, most sources agree that the emperor was advised that consuming mercury could make him immortal. He took pills, or perhaps wine mixed with honey and mercury, and looked forward to living forever. Instead, Qin Shi Huangdi died fairly quickly. Before long, the empire that he'd so carefully cultivated lurched into civil war and disintegrated. But though Shi Huangdi never attained his dream of immortality, he nevertheless left an enduring mark on China. In China's Shaanxi province, thousands of terracotta soldiers and horses, once commissioned by the emperor to guard his tomb, have been found. Though the emperor's mausoleum itself hasn't been opened, ancient texts suggest it was filled with model palaces, pavilions, and offices. When fighting in battle, most warriors can assume they're safe once their enemy is vanquished. But Viking chieftain Sigurd Eysteinsson was bizarrely killed by his foe in 892 CE, after he'd already cut off his head. According to History Collection, Sigurd the Mighty was known for his military prowess. Working with other chiefs, Sigurd succeeded in conquering most of northern Scotland and, in 875, his brother gifted him the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands. As the Earl of the Islands, Sigurd continued to conduct raids into mainland Scotland. He drew the ire of a Pictish chieftain named Maelbrigg Tusk, also called Maelbrigg the Bucktooth, because of his protruding teeth. Maelbrigg proposed that their two armies battle it out with 40 men apiece. But when the two forces met, Maelbrigg realized that Sigurd had deceived him. Instead of 40 men, the Viking chieftain had brought 80. Though Maelbrigg and his men put up a brave fight, Sigurd and his troops easily overpowered them, and Sigurd himself cut off Maelbrigg's head. Sigurd then tied Maelbrigg's severed head to his saddle, and the triumphant Vikings rode home. During the journey, however, Maelbrigg's famous buck teeth scraped against Sigurd's exposed leg. The wound became infected, and Sigurd the Mighty died soon afterward. King Henry I was no stranger to royal deaths. The youngest son of William the Conqueror, he certainly knew the explosive details of his father's funeral. But Henry, too, would meet a strange fate, and it had to do with fish. After outliving one brother and outmaneuvering another, Henry took the English throne in 1100. As king, he dedicated his time to revamping the royal justice system, building a grand abbey in Reading, and indulging his love of lampreys, a boneless fish historically favored by England's royals. There was just one problem. Every time that Henry ate lampreys, he felt sick. According to medieval historian Mark Morris, doctors had warned Henry about eating lampreys before, but the king had waved away their worries. And after hunting in Normandy in 1135, he called for his favorite meal. Medieval chronicler Henry of Huntingdon described the aftermath, writing, "Tea. His meal brought on a most destructive humor and violently stimulated similar symptoms, producing a deadly chill in his aged body and a sudden and extreme convulsion. Against this, nature reacted by stirring up an acute fever to dissolve the inflammation with very heavy sweating. Soon afterward, King Henry I died. Doctors apparently ascribed his royal death to a surfeit of lampreys. Of all the royal demises on this list, perhaps none are as well known as Princess Diana's death. On a summer night in 1997, the ex-wife of England's then Prince Charles died in a shocking car crash at the age of 36. By the time of her death, Diana had become one of the most recognizable people in the world. She married Charles, who is now king today, in 1981 at the age of 20 and had two sons with him, Prince William and Prince Harry. But Diana's glamour and beauty drew the paparazzi, as did rumors of discontent in her marriage. By 1997, Diana and Charles had a very public and very messy divorce. After leaving her husband and the royal family, Diana publicly moved on with Dodi Al-Fayed, the son of Harrods department store owner Mohammed Al-Fayed. Sadly, their love affair would end in tragedy. On August 31, 1997, Diana and Al-Fayed had dinner at the Ritz in Paris, France. According to People, they decided to leave the hotel and stay at Al-Fayed's apartment instead because of paparazzi. But when they got into a waiting car, the photographers pursued them. Shortly after midnight, the royal car spun out of control while speeding at 121 miles per hour into a tunnel near the Seine River. Al-Fayed and the driver, Henri Paul, who was later found to be inebriated, died at the scene. Diana died several hours later, and her bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, the only person to be wearing a seatbelt, survived with serious injuries. Diana's royal death, and the deaths of the other royals on this list, prove one thing. Though royals can seem godlike, they're only human. They might die in unremarkable ways or in truly bizarre ones, but they were no more infallible than the people they ruled.